Chapter 17. The Hurricane. The motorboat continued to speed toward the horizon as Homer tugged at the wheel. "Turn off the motor!" Pete shouted above the whistling wind. Homer seemed too frightened. Pete leaned over and clicked off the switch. The boat slowed but did not stop. "Here comes someone!" Pete cried. A man in a low-slung powerboat passed them at a little distance. Pete thought he was Uncle Russ's next-door neighbor. The boy rose and waved his arms, shouting for help. The man evidently did not hear him, and merely thought the boy was being friendly. He waved back and continued on toward shore. The current continued to carry the motorboat out into the ocean. By this time the beach was so far distant that Pete could not distinguish familiar landmarks. If help did not come quickly, they might be lost at sea. Homer began to cry. "Oh, why did I take this old thing out?" he whimpered. Putting his hand into his pocket, he pulled out the key to Scowbanger's beach buggy and handed it to Pete. "Maybe if you take this, I'll be forgiven and will be rescued." Pete was completely disgusted with Homer, but he had little time to think about it. He kept standing, hoping that by some miracle the boys would be seen. "How will we ever get back?" Homer wailed. "Oh, if we only had oars along, we could row back." "But we haven't," Pete said tersely. After the boys had floated around for half an hour, the sky began to grow dark. "An awful storm's coming up," Homer burst out, glancing up at the ominous black clouds that were rolling close to the surface of the sea. A few minutes later, a strong wind whipped the waves into frothy whitecaps, and a few drops of rain fell on the boys' faces. The boat began to pitch and toss. "We'll overturn and drown," Homer wailed. Pete told him to keep up his courage. "If we lie down in the bottom of the boat, we may be able to ride this storm out," he said. The boys did this, covering themselves with a tarpaulin to keep off the rain, which now came pelting down in sweeping white sheets. As the wind grew more violent, the waves became higher and the boat pitched up and down at a frightening angle. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed over the churning sea. All at once, Pete thought he heard the motor of another boat. Lifting his head up from under the tarpaulin, he listened intently. He was not mistaken. As the sound grew closer, the boy raised himself on his knees and peered about. Then he scrambled up, waving his arms wildly. "Homer, a boat! It's come to rescue us!" The other boy stood up in time to see a large launch making its way toward them. It was a white boat, and on the prow were the words Coast Guard. 4 men were in the boat. Pete at first could not distinguish who they were, but when the craft pulled alongside, he noticed that one of the men in an oilskin slicker was Uncle Russ. The 3 others were Coast Guardsmen. "Thank goodness we found you," Uncle Russ said. "If it hadn't been for my neighbor, we wouldn't have known where you were." The men held the 2 boats together, and the boys scrambled into the large launch. Then one of the seamen tied Homer's motorboat onto the back of the launch, and they headed for the shore. "Now, suppose you 2 fellows tell us how you happened to be out here," Uncle Russ urged. Pete disliked being a tattletale, so he did not speak up at once. Homer, evidently frightened at what he had done, told the story. "I was only fooling," he concluded, "and I gave Pete the key, and I was going right back, but I couldn't." He began to whimper again. My father's going to punish me for breaking his boat." The Hollisters hoped that Homer had learned his lesson, but nevertheless, Pete said, "The rudder's only jammed. It can be fixed easily." Then he turned to the Coast Guardsmen. After thanking them, he said, "If we'd drifted around for days, I might have missed the kite-flying contest day after tomorrow." One of the men smiled. "I hear it's going to be the biggest contest yet." When the launch arrived at the Coast Guard dock, the rest of the Hollister family, Scowbanger and Mr. Ruffley, were there to meet them. Mrs. Hollister hugged Pete, but Mr. Ruffley merely grabbed Homer by the arm and shook him. "You'll be punished for taking the boat as soon as I get it into a dock," he said angrily. Pete gave Scowbanger the key, and he thanked the boy with a clap on the shoulder. He said they would continue to search the next day. Then the old man hurried off. The Hollisters went home, and Pete changed into dry clothing. By supper time, the storm had grown even fiercer. The newscast said it was a hurricane, but that it should pass out to sea during the night. The announcer warned that nobody should go out on the beach until the gale was over. A letter had come for Pete, and he opened it eagerly. It was from Dave Mead, who wrote that Joey admitted knowing what had happened to Mr. Sparr's compass. He had seen Zip bury it in the Hollister garden, but had not let on, just for spite. Joey had shown Dave the spot. He had dug up the compass and returned it to the retired sailor. "Crickets!" exclaimed Pete, and read the whole letter to the others. "Now I can keep the compass I bought to give to Mr. Sparr." "Zip's mischief turned out okay after all," declared Pam gaily. Before going to bed, Pete worked on his seagull kite, painting eyes and a beak on the bird's head. Pam and Holly busied themselves with the doll box kite. When they finished, Pam said, "Look at this, Pete. I've put the doll's head on a swivel so that it will rock back and forth in the wind." "Swell, the kite-flying judges should like that." The children went to sleep, listening to the howling winds. But when they awoke the next morning, the storm had ended and the sun was shining. "Now we can dig for the pirate treasure," Pete said as they finished breakfast. The children could hardly wait to pick up the shovels and spades and hurry off down the beach to meet Scowbanger. When they reached the Frog Rock, the beachcomber had not yet arrived. "How different everything looks here," Pam remarked as she glanced around the beach. A hill of sand, which had been standing there the day before, now had moved far down the beach. Part of a big dune had washed away, leaving great chunks of clay lying along the edge of the water. "Where'll we start digging?" Ricky asked. "Let's start at this low spot," Pete said, pointing out a large area where the wind had already helped to dig a big hole some distance back from the water. Their shovels began to fly, and the hole in the sand grew deeper. Suddenly, Ricky's spade hit something. He picked it up. 2 old coins. "Look what I found!" he shouted. The others ran to his side, and Pete examined the dull brown-colored coins. "They have Spanish words on them," he said excitedly. "We must be near the pirate treasure." Ricky's find spurred the children to dig even faster. The hole became deeper. All at once, Pam's shovel struck something solid. She dropped to her knees and scooped away the sand with her hands. "There's something wooden buried here," she called out. All of the children came to help her clear away the wet sand. More and more of the wood began to show. It proved to be a plank, and it was connected to another and then another. Finally, Pete stood erect, a startled expression coming over his face. "You know what this is," he shouted. "It's the deck of a ship." "We've found the mystery!" Holly shrieked. Could it be true? Had they found the wreckage of the pirate ship which had been lost for 100 years? "We still have to prove that this is the mystery," Pete reminded the others. The children dug so fast there was a great shower of flying sand. The larger the hole became, the more the deck was revealed. Finally, they uncovered the prow of the boat. There, in big copper letters, was its name, The Mystery. "This is it, all right," Pam cried happily, and all the children whooped and danced. Suddenly, they saw a group of men trudging along the beach. A boy was with them. "Mr. Ruffley and Homer!" Ricky cried. When the men saw the pirate ship, they stared in amazement. Then Mr. Ruffley said, "So you kids found it." He laughed loudly. "That's fine. Come on, we'll go down into the hold and get that treasure we've been looking for."